Welcome to the Doppelgänger conversations, again here from Fermoy House at the David Roche Foundation in Adelaide. And tonight my guest is Geraldine Kirrihi Barlow, Head of International Art of the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, QAGOMA in Brisbane. Welcome, Geraldine.
Thanks, Rochus.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity to discuss with you tonight the topic of copies in contemporary art practice. Tonight's conversation is part of the UniSA, SIDA Foundation and the David Roche Foundation Curatorial Research Fellowship in Interior Design and Decoration. The theme we investigate during this fellowship is the topic of the Doppelgänger, explorations on the original and the copy in the post-digital age. And it's an investigation into the potentials and promises, as well as the limitations and specificities of digital technologies in design. While tonight we're going to talk about art and how that might influence our view on these technologies. David Roche Foundation's Fermoy House and its collection of decorative arts has been the site of the investigation for this research project. And we are developing a series of Doppelgänger based on a number of selected artifacts from David Roche's collection and have created digital copies, including AR objects, digital animations, and VR experiences. We're also currently fabricating 2 physical Doppelgängers using digital fabrication technologies. The outcomes of this research fellowship have been exhibited in December last year, 2021. As a first project part, and in July they will be presented in the David Roche Foundation's main gallery for the duration of the month of July. By experimenting with alterations of original artifacts, uncanny new characters emerge, offering novel perspectives, creating alternative realities and enabling an exploration of new forms of representation. And I think I have a feeling that's also what we're going to talk about as a consequence for art production and artistic creative works tonight. So this series of conversations, just for our viewers, is developed as an intellectual, historical, and conceptual framework for the research project. So we're not explicitly talking about the work we're producing during this fellowship, but the conversation allows us for reflections, provocations, and discussion concerning the topics related to the concept of Doppelgänger. But before we start to discuss the topic, let me introduce Geraldine Barlow properly. In your CV, you write you're born on the Yarra River and now live on the Brisbane River, and you're connected across the waters to Hokianga, Aotearoa, and Ireland and England. Whilst at QAGOMA, you have contributed to the, for example, the 9th Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art, working with Janan Al-Nani and Jonathan Jones. You created Gerhard Richter, an exhibition, Pablo Di Gasso, Sugar Spin, You, Me, Art and Everything, and many other really major exhibitions at QAGOMA. You've also been senior curator at Monash University Museum of Art in Melbourne for a long time. You've been manager and project manager and curator at ACA, the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art. You've been involved at the Melbourne International Festival of the Arts, Melbourne International Biennial, and Heide Museum of Modern Art in Melbourne. So you've got a very, broad, long experience as curator, manager in major museums and collections in Australia.
You also work.
Say again?
You asked me for the long version.
Yes, no, I think that's really, it's really valuable to understand someone's background and where they come from. And you also work, across the waters in New Zealand, in Christchurch, and you were involved in the Centre for Visual Arts in Cardiff. You write about the works you've been creating for catalogs, but you also publish in other magazines, and journals in art, in like, Art Australia, Art Monthly, and Art World. So I think, it's really great to have you, and it's my utmost pleasure to really have that conversation, and also in parts listen to you and ask you questions about your background in terms of, or your position in terms of this concept of the doppelgänger and the copy, or the role of the original and the copy in contemporary art practice. And you will discuss a couple of examples from artworks which use the concept of doppelgänger or the concept of copy. So I'm really looking forward to this, and I hand over to you to introduce the two projects you like to talk about. And after each of them, we're going to have a conversation, or I will ask you questions and develop together some concepts and thoughts on those projects. Thanks, Geraldine.
Thanks very much, Rochus. And I feel like we're already in something of a virtual digital doppelganger, aren't we, with this interesting place that you've created for us, bringing us into the one room, our virtual selves. And yeah, interesting for me, I haven't been to the David Roche Museum, so it's kind of like my first visit to look at this this collection, and be intrigued by particularly these, I think, like half reliefs on the walls. Seem to me like portraits in a way, which perhaps have a little link through to the two artworks I thought might be interesting for us to talk about, just to look at two different approaches to doppelganger. And one of them is by an artist who many of you might know, Ron Muick, originally Australian born and now London based, I believe. We have a quite spectacular work of his in the Queensland Art Gallery collection called In Bed, and it is a very, very large sculpture of a woman in bed, and you see her kind of lying there with the big white doona pulled up to her chest, and she's looking to the distance, almost a little bit concerned or fearful, perhaps even a bit anxious or unsure. And so she's remarkably fleshy. So it's quite an incredible thing for an artist, even in a painting such as we see as the background behind us, to give that sense of warm human flesh. And I think this is one of the great and classical kind of conundrums and effects of an artwork, to not just signify something, but really to give that sense of it having a lifelike quality. And that's something really difficult to do at such an oversized scale. And each hair of her hair is articulated. I think the artist might have used horsehair. I'm kind of moving quite swiftly actually to that technical question, which I think is often something which comes up with the idea of the doppelganger. How is it done? Is it something that happens in our minds, or something which happens with the kind of technique? The Ron Muick work, and I think many of his works are very popular with audiences, probably because of this conjunction of those questions around technique. So it's definitely an artwork where you don't get people saying, my kid could have done that. It's very much, how is it done? So technique is one of the wow factors of the work. But also I think there's this human empathetic quality of that another life, another body, and the expressive way in which that body is situated really asks us to relate to that person, you know, is she a giant? You know, what is she doing in the gallery where the public are, and is she perhaps naked while we're all clothed? You know, what is she afraid of? We're planning to feature her in an upcoming exhibition I'm working on called Air. And in fact, the reason why my biography related to water was because that was a past major exhibition I worked on. And, you know, I think water is something that connects us all via our, you know, the waters where we were born, via our ancestors and to each other, but similarly air. And for this context with Ron Muick's work, we, you know, feel that she's kind of looking off into maybe not the far distance, maybe the near distance where the audience might be, with a little bit of concern about what might be there, and reflecting on our recent experience of COVID and many people being in isolation, this uncertainty about the unseen, we felt it was quite a relevant work. So yeah, Rochus, I don't know if you've got any remarks on
Yeah, so with it's kind of hyper realistic Ron Muick's artwork, and it's kind of, you know, you look at it and you think it's like a human person, but then there's something, I think, quite often in his work with about the scale. It's either smaller or it's bigger, so you kind of can't be mistaken, because we kind of know there are no gnomes and there are no giants. But on a photography, you would immediately think like, oh, is that now a real person or not? So this kind of, do you think by scaling it, it's a way of kind of still creating that surprise moment while you can relate to it because it's so realistic? Or what do you think the role of scale might be in that copy? You know, because it's like it's another human being, but it's not. But it looks so much. I remember the first time I saw one, I walked in and I'm going, huh? Like, what's happening here? Someone's lying on the floor, and then going, oh no, it doesn't move, it doesn't breathe. It's you know, it's like a different relationship. But it got that moment of surprise when you see it first and you don't expect it because you might have not heard about it, you didn't read the introduction or whatever. But like the role of scale, I think is something I think is interesting.
It's really fascinating, isn't it? And how do you, in a sense, as an artist, maybe dial up or cause our reactions in a way that would be different to just a one-to-one scale. And I think you know, I'm not sure if that was his work, Dead Dad, the kind of sculpture of his father dead, lying on the floor, which is less than a one-to-one scale. And you know, I think that's very poignant there, because it's almost as if his father is like the scale of a child, and you know,
an old man at the same time.
And that sense of perhaps someone who was so influential, such a profound impact upon his life, you know, is the impact of death to diminish us? Like, is that the reason why the scale is smaller? And I think there's no clear answer. You know, the first work I saw of Ron Muick's was, I think, called Boy at the Venice Biennale in the Arsenale, and it's the famous kind of very crouching boy. Trying to recall if he's somewhere between maybe like I don't know, I would imagine like 6, 8, 9 years old. I have to double check on that one, but and his gaze kind of you know, darts to the side, and he's kind of somehow like curled up like this. So yeah, I think there's a sense of a fear, or kind of being squashed into the space, and yeah, and definitely this uncanny quality, which, you know, I think I don't know if we should talk about that, Rochus, and what is that? But with the Doppelgänger, is it this grounded in this sense of our own uniqueness, and is that something to do with the way we experience our own sense of self, that the idea of any kind of copy is uncanny and unsettling and unnatural?
Yeah, but is there also, like with his scale, for example, scaling up or down, is there also that level of alien or alienation where it becomes also strange at the same time? So it's like kind of the whole, and same with the topic of copy and original. It's like there is something which you can relate to, but then there's something which is really estranged or uncanny, as you said, or alien. So, which then I often think that creates that opportunity for us as a viewer of that work to engage more, because it creates more attraction or attention, because there's something not quite wrong. So it's like entering a room where you feel very familiar, but then something has been changed and you're not sure what has changed. So that way you suddenly start looking at what's different without knowing it. You know what I mean? Like by estranging something, you draw more attention to it because you want to know what's kind of not quite right. If you would not do that, you would go, oh yeah, it's another person and I know a figure and blah, blah, but then yeah, whatever. So I think this kind of play with scale, alienation, estrangement, uncanniness is something which draws our curiosity of really wanting to know more about it, because it is different. And in that sense, maybe it's fundamentally artistic, because
Yeah,
it's
well,
kind of different to our normal world, you know what I mean?
it raises an interesting question of what is it about making a copy that makes it artistic?
Yeah.
Yeah, is it the choice of scale, or is it the choice of dress? Or you might have an artist like Patricia Piccinini, who would work more with some kind of change that the body's undergone. I'm trying to think if there's anyone. I'm sure that there are people who don't work so overtly with making strange, but it suddenly becomes a whole other category. And I think also then you have a different approach to looking at how at the making of the of that other creature, or that body, that doppelganger, that copy. Ronnie Van Hout is another artist who I've really enjoyed working with, and he is known for quite a very wide variety of sculptures where he uses his own face and body, but sometimes he'll put his face onto other bodies, or something that's quite blockish and not fully formed. So the strangeness there is very much about the making, the kind of movement from raw materials into a sense of a person, and then not just any person, but him. And he has very particular look. He's quite an unusual looking guy, and so if you see a form of him, or there was a show that I did once called Too Much of Me, 7 Paths Through the Absurd with Detour. It was a title that was very much too much, and kind of about artists, almost this point at which you want your work to be about yourself, but when is it too much about yourself? And so amongst the works of Ronnie's we had in that show, he'd made a set of dolls of himself that were in these little kind of coffin boxes, in kind of a tiny little version of a suit that he wore, and kind of looking quite fiercely as he does. And yeah, and I think that was the kind of interesting, his practice has been a really extended questioning of the self-portrait and this universe of doppelgangers of Ronnie Van Hout.
Mm-hmm. So that copy and original, I mean, if we look at that painting just behind us, that portrait, which tries to be, a representation of of a person. So it's a portrait which somehow tries to represent that person instead of photography. The question of realism, or like, the hyperrealism you had with Ron Mück. And the question of estrangement, I'm not sure where I'm going with this question, but it's something I'm fascinated with, like, you know, this kind of, how close do you go that it becomes basically, or what does a copy even mean? Like, you know, is it the same as the original, or is it in product design, you know, you would produce thousands of identical pieces. In art, it's exactly about the kind of that difference, and in creative works, that slight difference, which might just shift a meaning a little bit by just a little bit manipulating it to the point where it becomes like, I mean, we're going to talk about in the exam about zombies. So it's kind of the resurrection of furniture pieces, which became something totally different than its original. But you still have that resemblance. So it's kind of the balance we're trying to have in our pieces. Like, it looks like it when you look at it first place, but then you walk through the space and suddenly that whole thing transformed into something else. So it's because it works with the 3 dimensions of it. So, but it's like this, is this, I mean, has that been a fascination in art beyond the point of representation of, you know, like statues for a long time, actually? I mean, I'm asking our art historian question, and we're actually talking about contemporary art, but are there influences like contemporary artists might refer to in history where they really interested in like this kind of representational form, which is fundamentally an architectural investigation as well? How do we represent those ideas we're developing through other means than the actual object? Is that something contemporary artists have been interested in a historical way as well? Is that something you would?
It's such a rich field, and so I think you know, contemporary artists very often draw upon that. Some more than others, but there's you know, there's so much inspiration there, and you know, you've got your larger movements within art history. And I think there's this element of trying to, at times, seeking a kind of realism, and you know, there's you know, different you know, ways of trying to understand you know, pictorial space and things like depth of space, and you know, the incredible you know, events of the Renaissance, and understanding of you know, the human body and anatomy and proportions. So they're very you know, tied to philosophy and architecture and science and medicine. So I think there's been, you know, art's always had an interest in seeking that kind of sense of the real, or to bring what's experienced in the world into the space of the artwork. You know, of course, there's that element where art was a way to stabilize something that was would be subject to death and fleeting, to give permanence to so much that's impermanent. But I think art is very much a stage as well, and a set of lenses to you know, demonstrate different ideas and knowledge, you know, fashion, and a sense of standing. So you know, it's always interesting to compare those works, such as the work behind us, as it would appear, which seem to be very much about establishing the standing of the gentleman in his you know, military dress and sash, and you know, with his hand to his waist, and you know, that's a portrait painted to be you know, proud of, and sit within a family context perhaps, and be passed through generations. And you know, it definitely speaks of a certain social standing. But against that, it's always interesting where artists innovate and do something quite different, or you know, self-portraits are often that place where artists show not only their show off their own skill, but also question what it is to be making art, and really show us that they're aware that this is a conversation through time, with people to come, and that becomes very interesting as well.
That's really interesting. That's really, really interesting. It also makes me think of what you just said of that, even neoclassicism refers to another period and creates kind of a copy of something, but then it becomes its own original. So it's kind of this whole confusion with, periods, even in a way where one could easily get caught in going, why is this not Romanesque in this century? But I think that's maybe because you talked about production as well. You want to talk about the second work you had prepared?
And maybe I might even just throw another little reference in.
Okay.
I think I'd mentioned to you just with that idea of even classicism or neoclassicism. There was an exhibition which unfortunately I wasn't able to see, but I thought it was very interesting at the Prada Foundation called Portable Classic. And so something I really love with Portable Classic was the way that a sculpture from antiquity would be picked up, and then different versions of that. So maybe the Roman version and maybe neoclassical versions would be brought together, and you would see those artists more recently in time looking back, and literally the sense of the model that they were working from and inspired by. And I think also Greek and Roman culture and classical culture has been such a kind of a bedrock of Western civilization. I think it's good to look at, why was this the case? Why were these this model of beauty and these particular narratives and myths almost the ornament to a polite or refined existence, as we seem to be occupying for this conversation.
Yeah, that's really interesing. But do you want to talk about the third project you had?
And maybe that's a little bit of a link through. So Hoda Ashfar is a contemporary artist, based largely in Australia now, but Iranian born. She's very much known as a photographer. But the piece, the work of hers, the project of hers that I thought would be interesting to talk about is called Agoniste, and it very much has the look of, it kind of seems to reference neoclassicism. And what I find quite wonderful in her work, I think sometimes, I suppose Greek mythology, there are really dramatic and profound stories which have been described, but there can be this sense of ornament and familiarity to those when we see those stories drawn into, white sculptures. And I think Hoda brings a very interesting other lens to this. Her project Agoniste is a collection of portraits, very interesting form of portrait of a group of whistleblowers. And so these are all people who, witnessed things about, generally through their work, and were uncomfortable with what they were seeing and tried to blow the whistle, but then have often suffered quite serious consequences. So, I think one was involved with the East Timor, and the case where the Australian government were spying on the Timorese, and in the negotiations around oil, and these were I think this person was a spy, but was felt that was not appropriate, the behaviour of the government. You know, there were people, there's a doctor involved with the treatment of asylum seekers. There is someone involved with a nursing home and activities occurring there. So from a range of quite, I suppose, extraordinary geopolitical events through to almost every day, the fabric of our society. That's probably the key thing I would say, that she's looking into the fabric of our society. And I think people who quietly and invisibly carry a huge load and can't always be seen through the nature of the what they've experienced or the legal situation around their case. And so she has you know, set up a dialogue with them and then brought them into a studio where she can photograph them with 110 cameras set into a special array, and from this produce a 3D data set, I suppose, from which a 3D printed you know, bust or portrait is created. And so these are all in white, and then she photographs these and has exhibited these kind of white busts within a abstract looking black space with a short paragraph about who we're looking at, often described via their occupation. So I think it's an interesting work in terms of that question of the doppelganger. I wouldn't say, it's not like it's a living, walking doppelganger, but there's a form of sense of use of digital technology to kind of measure and record and make another version of this person. And no, perhaps when the creation of a person or the copying of a person becomes physical somehow, I think we have a different attitude to it as compared to our attitude to photography, like knowing that that's always two-dimensional.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I thought it might be an interesting work to discuss in that regard.
Also interesting that a photographer uses a 3D modeling technology, which is based on photography, photogrammetry. And I think in terms of copy, I have the thought that the photography would really, you know, be a similar level passport photo and identify someone very clearly, while having that abstract kind of representation and 3D modeling and transition for the digital technology makes it something where you can relate to an individual, but you might not necessarily as clearly identify that person as kind of, often whistleblowers then get represented by blurring the face or showing them from the back when they get, filmed. So, yeah. But that's a way where you can still look into their face, into their eyes, but maybe there's a transition where it doesn't become exactly a precise representation of that person, so you can't identify them. So it's kind of also a process of creating an anonymity around that person, but still being able to relate to it, which is often then this kind of trust relationship. If I can't see the person, do they really exist? Did the reporter make it up? So it's creating that relationship with an identity, and then the story around it, I think, is a really interesting way. It's very close to what we're doing with like 3D modeling and scanning and digital grafting and 3D printing and CNC milling and all the technologies we're exploring in order to create another original in a way. I would not almost refer to it as a copy. So based on a digital copy, because that's a digital copy of the original, we're creating a doppelgänger, which is another original in a way. And what happens in that process of, in a way, translation. And I think what's interesting with her, Hoda, is that she's taking that as an advantage, that there is also a level of unpreciseness in that process, which is funny enough not what we normally think digital technologies do. I think the current or general idea is that digital technologies are amazingly precise, but then we realize that each process has something where there's a gray zone or there's something fading off or something's missing, and then you start manipulating that, and each of them has their own limitations and create their own kind of aesthetics. And I think that's really interesting in terms of production and what that then creates as an artifact, which then speaks another language than the ones we're used to. So, you know, if she would have done that in a marble classical figure, it would have been a different relationship and also a different process. So I'm very much interested in these kind of processes, using a particular tool set and technology, what that allows you and how it limits you, but how it also opens up new possibilities. I think that's really what this research project is about, what we're doing in a way. So it's quite interesting to refer to Roda. Yeah.
And to me, I think that there's a quality, like you can sense that the person would be recognizable to their loved ones. And I think because they're all in processes of negotiation, like they've all had to speak up to tell their stories and suffer for that. And I think there's a really interesting way in which she's using this technology, which is quite new for her, but it's kind of, to me, it seems like it's chasing this quality of bearing witness, and that she's trying to look at them. You know, she's got like 110 cameras and she's trying to, like, it's almost surrounding them. I think there's a lot of care in her project, like it also even in the text, in the way that she writes an account of the complexity of what these people have all experienced. And yeah, so I think there's this sense of looking and bearing witness in terms of the way the technology is applied. But it's got a real, like, repetition and echo around the doppelganger or the copy or repeat question, because you know, she's then taking it on into other spheres to you know, not so much showing the 3D printed element and more showing the photographs with the text. And then she has a video she's made where she focuses on other parts of the person's body as they have opportunity to speak about their experience. So, you know, I think there's also this interest in the kind of slippage between you know, how to tell a story and how to represent a person or their experience. So, and then that representation, be it an artwork or a story, it goes out and has another kind of life. And I suppose many of us are kind of represented in quite different ways, you know, and that's, I think art really can offer many kinds of representations of the one person through time, through different styles, through different viewers' eyes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That we could go into the whole storytelling as a part of that, but I think we might come to an end here. It was a really interesting, you know, insight in an exchange of ideas and examples, and I'm going to add the links to the examples at the end of this video so people can go back and maybe look online whether they can find more about the precedents we've been discussing. But I'd really like to thank you for, you know, tonight, taking the time, having that conversation, speculating about copy and original, role in art, discussing particular examples and technology, reproduction, storytelling. So I think it's, we touched on quite a lot of really interesting topics. But as always, one can't really grab, it's more like an exchange of ideas rather than kind of, you know, a fixed definition of what is what. But really great to talk to you about, you know, contemporary examples of doppelganger and the role of the original and the copy. Thanks very much, Geraldine. I'd like to thank the foundation for the opportunity to undertake these conversations and for the fellowship and hosting us. And I like to draw the attention of the viewers to our forthcoming exhibition starting on July 1 in the main gallery at the David Roche Foundation in Adelaide, which will be looking at these topics and create artifacts, copies, originals, limited editions, which explore through digital technologies and processes and refer to artifacts we chosen from David Roche's collection here in Adelaide. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us, and goodbye. Thanks, Geraldine.